The taste of almonds meant I had approximately 90 seconds to live, and the realization arrived with the same clinical detachment that had kept me breathing through 6 months of this gilded hell. My tongue processing the familiar bitter notes of cyanide derivative even as my throat began to close and my vision started to narrow at the edges. The exquisite, rancor brandy that Lord Vaden had been about to consume now burning its way through my digestive tract like promethium, and somewhere in the back of my failing consciousness, I understood that this was it. This was the death I'd been postponing with each careful taste, each measured sip, each moment of paranoid vigilance since the day I ascended from the manufacturum levels of Hive Sibelius and traded one form of slow death for another that came wrapped in crystal decanters and silver serving platters. The Medici servitors were already moving toward me before I hit the floor, their mechanical efficiency a perfect expression of my value to House Vaden, worth saving if the antidote existed and the poison was known, worth discarding if my death proved nothing could be done, and in the 3 seconds it took for my knees to buckle and my body to begin its involuntary convulsions, I had time to think about Lissa, my sister still trapped in the mid-hive, still dependent on the wages I sent her each month, still believing that my service to the nobility was a blessing rather than a death sentence written in exotic compounds and time-delayed toxins. Arch-Seneschal Morvain appeared in my fading peripheral vision, his face showing the same mild concern he might display for a malfunctioning servitor, already calculating the time required to train my replacement, already composing the message that would inform House Margrave that their attempted assassination had been detected, already moving past my dying body toward the more important question of who would taste Lord Vaden's next meal while I was being processed through whatever protocol they maintained for expendable servants who had fulfilled their primary function. The antidote burned worse than the poison, flooding my system with compounds that fought the cyanide in a chemical war that used my organs as its battlefield, my body becoming a testing ground for the Medica's expertise, and through the agony, I could hear Medici Toxicant Hardros listing the poison's components with the detached interest of a scholar identifying a particularly clever formulation, noting the delayed activation mechanism that had allowed the brandy to pass initial screening, commenting on the unusual binding agent that had masked the scent, treating my near death as an academic exercise in toxicology rather than a human being's brush with extinction. I survived, though the word seemed inadequate for what I experienced in the hours that followed, my nervous system still firing random signals long after the immediate danger had passed, my hands shaking so badly I could not hold water without spilling it, my enhanced taste sensitivity, the very gift that had condemned me to this service, now permanently altered by the chemical assault, certain flavors forever changed or lost entirely. Phantom tastes appearing when nothing touched my tongue, my body's attempt to process trauma through the same sensory mechanisms that had detected the poison in the first place. Lord Vaden summoned me to his chambers 3 days later when I could stand without assistance, and I made the long walk through corridors lined with tapestries depicting House Vaden's glorious history, past rooms where other servants performed their duties with the mechanical precision of people who understood their lives held value only in relation to their function, through checkpoints manned by household guards whose augmented bodies marked them as worth the investment of enhancement, while people like me were deemed too temporary to merit anything beyond basic medical intervention when we proved useful enough to save. "Theron Max," Lord Vaden said when I entered his presence, and the fact that he remembered my name felt like both an honor and a curse. Acknowledgement that I had risen above the anonymous mass of expendable labor to become a known quantity, someone whose continued survival served House Vaden's interests. "You detected the poison where 3 screening servitors found nothing. Your sensitivity exceeds our technological measures." I bowed, understanding that this compliment was also a sentence. My usefulness ensuring my continued service, my value guaranteeing that I would face more poisons, more attempts on Lord Vaden's life, More opportunities to die in place of a man who had never questioned whether the system that protected him was worth the lives it consumed. "I serve House Vedan," I said, the required words that every servant learned, the formula that acknowledged our place in a hierarchy where questioning was heresy and obedience was the highest virtue. "Your sister will receive a bonus this month," Lord Vedan said, and the casual mention of Lissa felt like a threat disguised as generosity, a reminder that House Vedan knew exactly what leverage they held over me, what kept me compliant when every instinct screamed to run, to flee, to choose honest starvation in the mid-hive over this slow poisoning disguised as privilege. "Continue your exemplary service, and she may even be brought to the spire, given work in the household, elevated alongside her brother." The promise was honey-laced with venom, the offer of bringing Lissa into House Vaden's service, meaning she would become another tool in their collection, another life they could threaten to ensure my compliance, another way to bind me to this service until my body finally succumbed to the cumulative damage that every taster suffered. The invisible wounds that accumulated with each poison survived, each antidote administered, each chemical assault weathered. But I smiled and bowed deeper, playing the role of grateful servant, understanding that in the Imperium of man there was no escape from systems designed to extract every ounce of value from human lives before discarding the depleted remains. That my choice was not between freedom and servitude, but between varieties of servitude, some offering better rations and cleaner deaths than others. The other tasters watched me with new respect when I returned to our quarters, a converted storage room near the kitchens where we waited between meals, too dangerous to mix with regular servants who might be compromised, too valuable to leave unsupervised, too expendable to merit comfortable accommodations. Yelena, veteran of 3 years and missing 2 fingers from a necrotic poison that had eaten through flesh faster than the antidotes could work, nodded approval. "You survived a deep one," she said, her voice carrying the rough quality of someone whose throat had been scarred by acid exposure. "Most don't come back from cyanide derivatives." Rochin, the disgraced noble sentenced to tasting as punishment for some political crime he never discussed, looked up from the medical texts he studied obsessively, trying to identify poisons before they killed him, trying to gain some measure of control over a service that was fundamentally about accepting powerlessness. "The compound bonding was elegant," he said, his aristocratic education evident in how he analyzed attempts on his own life with scholarly detachment. "Whoever formulated that poison understood chemistry at a level that suggests Millennium temple, training, or something close to it." Elise, the child who had arrived 2 weeks earlier, small enough that standard poison doses hit her system twice as hard, young enough that she still sometimes cried at night when she thought no one was listening, stared at me with wide eyes. "Does it always hurt that much?" she asked. And I wanted to lie, wanted to tell her that you got used to it, that subsequent poisonings were easier, but the truth was that each one damaged you in new ways, each survival depleting reserves that never fully replenished, each brush with death leaving you diminished even when the Medici declared you recovered. "Yes," I said, because she deserved honesty, even if honesty was cruelty, because she needed to understand what she had become, what we all were in the eyes of House Vaden and every other noble house on Scintilla. Tools that detected poison through the simple expedient of dying when the food was contaminated. Our deaths proof that worked just as well as our survival. Our value measured not in our lives, but in what our deaths prevented. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt like drowning in slow motion, each day bringing new meals to test, new opportunities to die, new demonstrations that my life had become a series of calculated risks undertaken for the benefit of people who would forget my name within days of my death. House Vedan hosted dinners for rival nobles where the political tension was so thick you could taste it alongside the poison traces we detected in 1 dish out of every 4, assassination attempts so common they barely merited comment. The great game of scintillant nobility played out across our bodies as we sampled imported wines and exotic meats and delicacies whose names I could barely pronounce. Each bite a small death survived or not survived. Each swallow a test passed or failed with permanent consequences. I learned the poison families the way a soldier learns to identify enemy units, categorizing threats by their symptoms and lethality, understanding that cardiotoxins would kill me in minutes through heart failure, that neurotoxins would destroy my mind before my body, that digestive poisons offered hours of agony before death, that gene-targeted compounds might bypass me entirely to kill Lord Vaden specifically, rendering my sacrifice meaningless. Medici toxicant hadros drilled us constantly, testing our ability to identify compounds by taste, timing our reactions, measuring our sensitivity, treating us like precision instruments that needed calibration, and in his cold efficiency, I recognized the same philosophy that governed all imperial institutions, that humans were resources to be optimized, that individual suffering was irrelevant beside operational effectiveness. The culture of paranoia that pervaded House Vaden's estate became my normal. The assumption that everything might be poisoned, that everyone might be compromised, that each meal could be Lord Vaden's last, and therefore mine as well. Servants were screened and rescreened, their families investigated, their associates monitored, the security protocols so extensive that they generated their own opportunities for infiltration, because no system could watch everyone all the time, because human nature ensured that somewhere in the vast machinery of household management, there would be a weak point, a bribed guard, or compromised kitchen worker, or ambitious body servant willing to betray their lord for the right price. House Margrave, House Barquette, House Consora. The names of rival houses became familiar as we tracked poison patterns, identifying which houses favored which methods, which toxins were signatures of particular poison crafters, which delivery mechanisms suggested specific political factions. Lord Vaden's position in the Calixian economy, his control over ship drive manufactorums and weapons production, his influence in the sector governor's court, all of these made him a target for nobles who saw assassination as a legitimate tool of commerce, who viewed murder as simply another form of negotiation, who treated human life as a currency to be spent in pursuit of power. I met Tybalt in my 3rd month of service, a body servant who had tended Lord Vaden's wardrobe for 8 years and who treated me like a human being rather than a walking poison detector, who shared news from other parts of the household, who explained the complex web of alliances and enmities that governed life in House Vaden. "You're adapting well," he said one evening when we found ourselves in the same corridor during a shift change, his observation carrying an undertone of sadness because adaptation meant accepting the unacceptable, meant normalizing horror, meant learning to function in a system designed to consume you. "I send money to my sister," I said, the only justification I could offer for my continued compliance, the single thread of purpose that kept me testing meals when every rational instinct said to refuse, to accept whatever punishment refusal would bring, to choose a quick death over this slow poisoning. "If I die, at least she eats." Tybalt nodded, understanding the mathematics of survival in Hive Sibelius, understanding that sometimes the best you could hope for was to delay death for those you loved, to purchase their comfort with your suffering, to find meaning in sacrifice because meaning was the only thing the Imperium's machinery could not extract from you, the one thing that remained yours even when everything else had been taken. The first major test came 4 months into my service when Lord Vaden hosted a formal dinner for Sector Governor Marius Hax himself, the most powerful man in the Calixis sector, and 6 tasters were assigned to work in rotation because the political stakes meant assassination attempts would be both frequent and sophisticated. The menu was an act of theater as much as sustenance, each course designed to impress, each dish selected to demonstrate House Vaden's wealth and taste and access to luxury goods from across the sector. And for us, it meant hours of continuous testing, our enhanced senses pushed to their limits as we sampled everything from imported fruits that could have been injected with toxins to xenos, cultured grains that skirted the edges of imperial law, to fresh grox meat from House Margrave's own herds. The irony of testing food from a rival house not lost on anyone. Elise died during the third course, her small body unable to process the dose of time-delayed digestive toxin that had been hidden in a fruit compote. Her system overwhelmed before the Medici could even attempt intervention, and I watched her convulse and foam and die while Lord Vadan and Sector Governor Hax discussed trade policy at the table barely 20 feet away, the nobles pausing their conversation only long enough to note that the poison had been detected, that their safety was assured, that House Vadan's security protocols had functioned exactly as designed. Her replacement arrived the next morning, a boy of perhaps 12 with the same wide-eyed fear that Elise had carried, and I understood that this was how the system perpetuated itself. Replacing lost tools with new tools, maintaining operational capacity through constant recruitment, ensuring that there was always another desperate soul willing to trade certain death for the possibility of temporary survival. Always another family in the mid-hive willing to sell their children for the wages that might keep the rest of them fed. The taste of luxury became associated with death in my mind. The finest foods humanity could create transformed into vehicles for murder. The art of cooking perverted into the science of killing, every exquisite flavor hiding the possibility of poison, every culinary masterpiece suspect. I developed a kind of double consciousness where I could appreciate the skill that went into a perfectly aged amasec, while simultaneously analyzing it for chemical signatures that indicated contamination, my mouth processing both aesthetic and lethal information simultaneously, my brain forced to hold contradictory assessments in a state of permanent tension. Medici toxicant Hadros called me to his laboratory in my 6th month, a space that was part apothecary and part torture chamber, lined with shelves holding thousands of compounds, each labeled with high Gothic designations that meant nothing to me but represented different ways to die. "You have survived longer than most," he said, his augmented eyes studying me with clinical interest, evaluating the damage accumulating in my body, calculating how much more use could be extracted before I broke. "Your sensitivity increases with exposure, your ability to detect poisons improving even as your overall health deteriorates." He had me taste 6 compounds, tiny doses measured in micrograms. My job to identify each one by flavor alone, and I understood that this was refinement, making me better at my job even as my job killed me, optimizing my function right up to the point of total failure. The compounds burned and numbed and twisted my perceptions, each one a small assault that Hadros catalogued with satisfaction, noting my accuracy rate, commenting on how exposure to certain toxin families had sensitized me to related compounds, treating my degenerating body as a successful experiment in human adaptation. "Most tasters last 6 months," he said when the testing was complete, offering this information with the casual delivery of someone discussing weather patterns. "You have reached that threshold. The cumulative damage will accelerate now, your organs struggling to process the antidotes we use as much as the poisons you ingest, your nervous system permanently altered by repeated chemical assault." "How long?" I asked, wanting to know the timeline of my own destruction, wanting to calculate how many more wages I could send to Lissa before my death, wanting to understand the parameters of my sacrifice. "A year, perhaps less," Hadros said. "Your liver shows scarring, your kidneys are operating at reduced capacity, your bone marrow produces red blood cells inefficiently. These are the inevitable consequences of the work, the price paid for the privilege of serving House Vadan." Privilege, as if what I experienced was fortunate rather than exploitative, as if my slow death was a blessing rather than murder distributed across months, as if the system that consumed my health was somehow noble because it operated within legal parameters and served the interests of my betters. The word hung in the air between us, and I said nothing because what could I say? What argument could I make that would change anything? What protest would matter to people who viewed my life as inherently less valuable than the safety of a man who had never worked a day, who had never worried about his next meal, who existed in a bubble of privilege so complete that he could not imagine the cost his comfort extracted from others? The political crisis came in my 7th month when Lord Vadan's eldest son Aurelius grew impatient for his inheritance, began meeting with representatives from House Barquette, started making moves that suggested he might arrange an accident for his father, might accelerate the transfer of power that would eventually come naturally, but not quickly enough for his ambition. The household staff whispered about it in corridors, speculated about whether Aurelius would succeed, worried about what a change in leadership might mean for their positions, and I understood that we existed at the mercy of people whose internal family disputes could reshape our lives completely, whose personal ambitions and resentments played out across the bodies of servants who had no stake in their conflicts beyond surviving them. Tybalt warned me directly when he learned that Aurelius had been seen in the poison markets, those semi-legal establishments where failed Millennium temple apprentices sold their expertise to anyone willing to pay, where toxicants developed during the Great Crusade were traded like narcotics, where the art of murder through chemistry flourished in Scintilla's shadows. "Something is coming," Tybalt said, his voice low, his words carrying the weight of someone who had seen succession struggles before, who understood that periods of transition were especially dangerous for expendable staff, who might be eliminated simply to ensure no witnesses remained. "Be careful what you taste, be honest about what you detect, and do not trust that your value will protect you." The special dinner came 3 days later, Lord Vadan dining with his inner circle. The food prepared by hereditary cooks whose families had served House Vadan for generations, the security so tight that assassination seemed impossible. And yet I tasted the sedative in the amasec before it reached Lord Vadan's lips, my tongue detecting the subtle chemical markers that indicated a compound designed to relax rather than kill, to make the target vulnerable rather than dead. I reported it, understanding that this might be my death because questioning a lord's prescribed medication was insubordination, but Arch-Seneschal Morvain dismissed my concern with a wave of his hand. "A mild relaxant, prescribed by the household physician," he said, his tone suggesting that I had overstepped my function, that detection did not include interpretation, that my job was to identify poison, not to question legitimate medical treatment. But Lord Vadan was alert enough that night to kill the assassin who came for him, blade in hand, hired by Aurelius to strike during what should have been sedated sleep. And my warning, though dismissed, had been noted, had been remembered when it mattered. Aurelius was brought before his father in chains, his conspiracy exposed, his co-conspirators identified, and I watched from my position against the wall as Lord Vadan pronounced sentence on his own son, exile to a lesser estate rather than execution, because patricide was traditional, but filicide was still taboo, because family was sacred even when family members attempted murder, because blood ties could not be completely severed no matter how much blood was spilled. The aftermath was worse than the assassination attempt itself. Paranoia consuming House Vadan like a plague. Everyone suspected, everyone investigated, trust shattered and replaced with constant surveillance. I was interrogated by household security, questions designed to determine whether I had been part of Aurelius's plot, whether my warning was genuine or calculated, whether I could be trusted or should be eliminated as a potential security risk. Medici Toxicant Hadros testified on my behalf, his dry recitation of my sensitivity ratings and detection accuracy apparently sufficient to establish my value as too high to discard on mere suspicion, and I was released but marked, suspected of competence and complicity in equal measure. Roshan died 2 weeks later, his body simply giving up after months of accumulated poisoning, organ failure that the Medici attributed to toxin saturation. the clinical term for what happened when you survived enough individual poisonings that the cumulative damage became lethal itself. I watched as they carried his body away, with the same efficiency they had shown with Elise, the same practiced movement suggesting this was routine, this was expected, this was simply what happened to people who did our work. And I understood that I was witnessing my own future, that Rochen's death was prophecy as much as tragedy. Yelena showed me her medical scans afterward, wanting me to understand what awaited, wanting to prepare me for the reality that survival was temporary, that every day we continued this service was borrowed time that would eventually be repaid with interest. Her liver was failing, scarred beyond repair, her kidneys operating at 30% capacity, her bone marrow producing malformed blood cells, her entire body breaking down under the strain of processing compounds that were never meant to be introduced into human systems, antidotes that were themselves toxic, the cure killing her almost as surely as the poisons. "We're walking corpses," she said, her voice carrying the flat acceptance of someone who had made peace with their fate, who had stopped fighting the inevitable and instead chose to find what meaning she could in the time remaining. "We just don't know when we'll stop." The question that had haunted me since my first day in House Vaden's service crystallized in that moment, became something I could articulate even if I could not answer. The fundamental calculation that everyone in my position eventually faced: was this better than what I had left behind? Was survival in luxury worth the cost it extracted? Was my death in service to House Vaden more valuable than my life would have been in the manufactorums? Was the money I sent Lissa sufficient justification for what I was becoming, for what I was accepting, for the system I was complicit in perpetuating? I had no answer, or rather I had multiple contradictory answers that coexisted uncomfortably, the truth being that there were no good choices, only degrees of exploitation, only varieties of survival that all involved sacrifice and suffering and compromise. The Imperium of man was built on such calculations, trillions of people making similar decisions every day, choosing between forms of servitude because freedom was not offered, enduring because endurance was the only alternative to death, and death was only preferable when suffering exceeded the human capacity to bear it. Arch-Seneschal Morvain summoned me to his office in my 8th month, offering me what he termed a promotion, a reward for my exemplary service, an acknowledgement of my value to House Vaden. "You will become senior taster," he said, his voice carrying the ceremonial weight of someone conferring honor. Completely blind to the horror of what he was offering, you will oversee other tasters, train new recruits, ensure the continued quality of our poison detection protocols. It was everything I had feared. Confirmation that I had become too valuable to release, that my survival had made me complicit in the system that consumed others like me, that I would now recruit and train and watch die the people who replaced those I had already seen killed, that I would become an active participant in the machinery rather than merely a victim of it. But I accepted because what choice did I have? Because refusal would mean my own death and Lysa's destitution, because the wages of a senior taster would let me bring her to the spire where she would be safer, if not free, because I had learned that you survived in the Imperium by accepting smaller evils to avoid larger ones, by making compromises that felt like betrayals, by finding ways to live with yourself, when living with yourself should have been impossible. Lissa arrived the next month, brought to House Vaden's estate and given work in the textile workshops where she would sew garments for nobles whose names she would never know, where she would be safe from the worst dangers of the mid-hive, where she would be fed and sheltered and exploited in ways that were gentler than what I endured, but still fundamentally dehumanizing, still reducing her to a function, still treating her life as valuable only insofar as it served House Vaden's interests. We met in a courtyard reserved for servants during their rest periods. The first time I'd seen her in 9 months, and she barely recognized me. My body transformed by the poisoning I'd endured. my hands shaking constantly now, my face gaunt, my eyes carrying the haunted look of someone who had stared at death too many times and understood that death was staring back. Waiting for its moment, she cried when she saw me, understanding without words what I had sacrificed to bring her here, what price I was paying for her safety, and I told her that it was worth it, that her life justified my service, that knowing she was fed and sheltered made everything bearable. And I believed it in that moment, even though I knew it was also a lie, that nothing could truly justify what I was becoming, that no external good could make right the fundamental wrongness of a system built on such exploitation. The summit came in my 9th month. Sector Governor Hax mandating a peace conference between rival houses at the Lucid Palace, that ancient structure carved from stone and history, built by lords whose names were lost to time but whose wealth had survived them. All major houses would attend, would dine together in a show of unity that fooled no one, and I would be tasting for Lord Vadan alongside dozens of other house tasters, each of us expendable, each of us knowing that this was the most dangerous assignment we would face. That political theater combined with genuine enmity created opportunities for assassins that might never come again. Medicae toxicant Hadros prepared us with grim efficiency, training us to identify poisons in seconds rather than minutes because seconds would be all we had, teaching us the signs of contact poisons that could be absorbed through skin, warning us about compound toxins that only became lethal when multiple substances combined in the digestive system, explaining that our job was not to survive but to detect, that our deaths would serve House Vadan just as well as our survival, as long as we managed to warn Lord Vadan before we died. Yelena did not go to the summit, her body too damaged, too weak, her usefulness exhausted, and I understood that I was seeing her for the last time, that she had weeks at most before complete organ failure, that the system had extracted everything it could from her and was now discarding the depleted remainder. I said goodbye with the same clinical detachment I had learned from the nobles, acknowledging her service, thanking her for teaching me, moving past her death toward the next task, because sentiment was a luxury that people like us could not afford, because caring too much about the dying would mean caring about my own approaching death, and I needed to maintain function, needed to keep working, needed to continue serving until my body absolutely could not. The Lucid Palace was everything the stories suggested, magnificence that took my breath away even knowing that this beauty was built on suffering, that every stone had been cut by slaves, that every decoration represented wealth extracted from workers who would never see such splendor, that the artistry I was admiring was also monument to exploitation, testament to a system that valued aesthetic achievement over human dignity, that treated beauty as more important than justice. The great hall held hundreds of nobles and thousands of servants, each house displaying their wealth through the quality of their retinues, the expense of their clothing, the extravagance of their presentations, and we tasters stood in plain sight, our function visible, our expendability obvious, everyone understanding that we were the first line of defense and also the first casualties, that our bodies were the screens through which assassination attempts would be filtered. The feast began with elaborate ceremony, each course arriving with ritual significance, and I tasted alongside other senior tasters from rival houses, our enhanced senses pushed to their limits, our bodies processing multiple samples per minute, our minds struggling to categorize and identify and assess, while our systems absorbed whatever toxins made it past initial screening. A taster from House Consra collapsed during the second course, his death so rapid it suggested Millennium temple methods or something equally sophisticated, and the feast continued around his dying body because this was expected, because tasters were supposed to die to protect their lords, because his death was proof that the system worked. I detected the contact poison during the third course, not through taste but through sensation, the strange tingling in my hands where I had touched the serving vessel's glaze, the subtle numbness that suggested something absorbing through skin, and I signaled Lord Vaden, who switched plates with a gesture so insulting it constituted public accusation. The political theater playing out at a level far above my understanding, but using my body as its medium, my survival, the evidence that justified Lord Vadan's insult, my detection, the weapon he wielded against House Margrave. The neural toxin came during the fourth course, hitting my system so fast I barely had time to understand what was happening before my vision went dark, and my limbs stopped responding, my enhanced senses detecting the poison even as those same senses were being systematically destroyed by whatever compound I had ingested, my last conscious thought being that this was it. This was the death I had been postponing. This was the price finally coming due. But Medici Toxicant Hadros appeared from somewhere, his prepared counteragents flooding my system with compounds that fought the toxin in a chemical war that felt like burning alive from the inside. My nervous system lighting up with pain signals that transcended anything I had experienced before. Agony so complete it became a kind of transcendence, and I understood in that moment why people broke, why servants went mad, why the mind sometimes chose insanity over continued consciousness, because consciousness meant feeling everything, meant processing horror without the mercy of ignorance. I woke days later in the Medici wing, my body covered in sensors, my blood being filtered through machines because my kidneys had shut down, my liver had failed, my bone marrow had stopped producing blood cells, my entire system in cascade failure that would have killed me if not for the extraordinary intervention that House Vaden deemed me worth. And I understood that my survival was not mercy, but calculation, that I had become too valuable to discard, that my detection of the assassination attempt had proved my worth exceeded the cost of keeping me alive. Lord Vadan visited, an unprecedented honor, standing beside my bed with the same satisfied expression he might wear after a successful business negotiation, seeing in my broken body evidence of his house's superior security protocols, proof that his investment in tasters paid dividends, confirmation that the system worked exactly as designed. "You saved my life definitively," he said, and offered me anything within reason. Any reward that did not involve freedom, because freedom was never within reason. Never part of the negotiation. Never something that people like him imagined people like me actually wanted. "My sister," I said through lips that barely moved, through a throat scarred by the poison's passage, through a body that felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who had died and been imperfectly resurrected. "Keep her safe, keep her fed. Let me see her." "Done," Lord Vadan said, and left, and I understood that I had traded my death for Lissa's security, that my continued suffering had purchased her comfort, that this was what passed for victory in the Imperium of man. These small negotiations at the edges of vast injustice, these personal solutions to systemic problems, these individual survivals that changed nothing about the structures that created the need for such desperate bargaining in the first place. Recovery took months, my body rebuilding itself slowly, incompletely, permanently damaged in ways that would affect every day I had. Remaining, my hands developed a tremor that never stopped. My sense of taste was partially destroyed, which made my job harder and more dangerous. My kidneys required regular dialysis to function at all. Chronic pain became my constant companion, and I looked in mirrors to see a man decades older than my actual age, worn down by service, used up by the system, surviving but not living, enduring but not thriving. Yelena died during my recovery, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated damage, and I was not there for her passing. Could not attend whatever ceremony House Vaden performed for departed servants, learned about her death through Tybalt, who delivered the news with sadness, but not surprise because we all knew it was coming, because death was the only retirement package that tasters received, because survival was temporary and death was certain, and the only variable was timing. I was promoted again when I could work, made senior taster with authority over all poison detection for House Vaden, given oversight of recruitment and training, responsible for maintaining the protocols that kept Lord Vadan alive at the cost of regular casualties among the people I supervised. I became what Yelena had been, the veteran survivor, the teacher, the person who trained others to die in service to a system neither they nor I had chosen. And I found that I could do it, that I could recruit desperate mid-hivers with promises of wages and elevation, that I could train them to detect poisons knowing most would die within months, that I could watch them succumb to toxins or cumulative damage and then recruit their replacements, that I could become part of the machinery that had nearly killed me because the alternative was being crushed by that machinery, and at least this way I could sometimes warn them, sometimes help them, sometimes make their service slightly less horrific, even if I could not make it survivable. Aurelius's agents came for me in my 11th month of service, trying to eliminate the taster whose survival had exposed his assassination attempt, trying to remove a witness who could testify to his treachery, and they were efficient and professional and would have succeeded if Tybalt had not warned me, if I had not learned to sleep lightly, if I had not developed the paranoia that kept all successful tasters alive. I survived the attack, but 2 of my junior tasters died in the crossfire. Their bodies used as shields by the assassins, their deaths purchasing my survival, and I understood that this was how the system perpetuated itself, how it created complicity, how it made everyone part of the problem because to survive, you had to accept others dying in your place, had to make calculations about whose life was worth preserving, had to become judge and executioner and survivor all at once. The Arbites executed Aurelius after that, his final attempt to kill his father crossing the line from internal house politics to actual heresy, and I watched the execution from a servant's gallery, seeing the man who had tried to have me killed die himself. And I felt nothing because I had learned that in the Imperium of man, death was so common it became meaningless, that individual deaths were simply data points in larger calculations, that the only thing that mattered was continuation, was survival, was maintaining function no matter the cost. Medici Toxicant Hardros called me to his laboratory in my 12th month, showed me scans of my organs, displayed the damage accumulating in my body with the clinical detachment of someone delivering weather reports. "You have perhaps 6 months," he said, not because he was cruel, but because he thought I deserved truth, because even in this system built on exploitation, there were moments of genuine honesty between people who understood they were all tools being used by larger forces. Your kidneys will fail completely. Your liver cannot regenerate faster than the damage accumulates. Your bone marrow is producing fewer and fewer viable blood cells. The poisons leave no trace because they do not need to, because the antidotes we use to save you are themselves toxic, because you are dying from the treatment as much as the disease. "Why tell me?" I asked, genuinely curious about his motivation, about why someone who had been part of this machinery would offer me information that served no operational purpose. "Because you deserve to know," he said, "because you have served faithfully and earned that much truth. Because in a system where everyone lies to everyone about everything, someone should have access to reality, even if that reality is dark." I had 6 months to put my affairs in order, to ensure Lissa would be provided for after my death, to train my replacement, to pass on what little wisdom I had gained through surviving longer than most. I met with her regularly, told her stories about the poisons I had detected and the meals I had tasted and the nobility I had observed, never mentioning how much I was dying, never explaining that each visit might be our last, never burdening her with knowledge that would only cause pain without changing outcomes. Lord Vadan hosted a succession feast in my 13th month, naming his heir from among his surviving children, a formal announcement that required the highest levels of security, because this was when rivals would strike if they were going to. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. This was when tasters like me earned whatever rewards they had been promised. 30 courses, each tested multiple times, hours of continuous exposure to compounds that ranged from harmless to lethal, my damaged body struggling to process the work, my failing organs barely keeping up with the demands of the job. The ceremonial wine came last, blessed by an ecclesiarchy priest, which meant nothing because priests could be corrupted just like anyone else, could be bribed or threatened or convinced that serving nobles was more important than serving the emperor. And I tasted it knowing that this might be my end, that poison could hide in blessed wine just as easily as in any other beverage, that my death here would at least be memorable, at least be witnessed, at least serve the function I'd been recruited for. It was clean, pure, safe, and I drank deeply anyway, taking a full serving for myself, because if it was poisoned, then I would die, saving Lord Vadan one final time, and if it was safe, then I would at least taste one last moment of genuine luxury before my body gave out completely. Nothing happened. The feast succeeded. Lord Vadan named his heir without incident, and I collapsed afterward from simple exhaustion. My body pushed past its limits, systems shutting down one by one in orderly succession. The Medicae wing became my home in the final weeks, my organs failing despite all their interventions, my body simply done, used up, exhausted beyond recovery, and Lord Vadan visited one last time to thank me for my service, to promise that Lyssa would be provided for, to assure me that my name would be remembered in House Vadan's annals of faithful servants, and I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, at the idea that remembrance mattered when I was dying at 24 from poisons intended for someone else, when my sacrifice had been involuntary, when my service had been exploitation dressed in fancy words, but I just nodded and smiled and played the roles of grateful servant one final time. Because why break character now? Why waste energy on truth when lies were so much more comfortable for everyone involved? Lyssa came to say goodbye, held my trembling hand, told me that the food in the spire was good, the best she had ever tasted, and I knew she was lying to give me comfort, to let me believe my sacrifice had meaning, to allow me the fiction that my death had purchased something valuable, and I loved her for it, loved her for understanding that sometimes lies are mercy, that sometimes truth is cruelty, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them die believing their suffering mattered. Tybalt brought Medicae Toxicant Hadros's report when I was too weak to move, reading it aloud because my vision had started to fail, and I learned that I had been the longest-serving taster in House Vadan's history. 13 months of continuous service, a record that proved either my exceptional ability or my exceptional luck, or simply that I had been more willing than most to endure what could not be endured, to survive what should not be survived, to continue functioning when function itself was violence against my body and soul. I died on a morning when light filtered through crystal windows, when the air in the Medicae wing smelled of antiseptic and incense, when I could hear servants moving through corridors, beginning their daily routines, and my last thought was wondering whether Lyssa would remember me as I'd been before House Vadan, or as I had become in their service, whether she would understand that I had done it for her, or whether she would resent the system that required such sacrifice, whether my death would teach her anything useful, or simply be one more tragedy in a galaxy full of tragedies, one more life extinguished by a system that consumed millions every day, without noticing, without caring, without changing. My name was added to the ossuary wall where House Vadan honored their faithful servants, carved in stone alongside hundreds of others who had died in service. And a new taster was recruited the same day, because the work continued, because Lord Vadan still needed to eat, because the system required constant feeding, because the machinery that had killed me needed new fuel, and somewhere in the mid-hive another desperate person was accepting an offer that seemed like salvation but was actually a different form of death, was choosing slow poisoning over fast starvation, was making the same calculations I had made and arriving at the same conclusions. That in the Imperium of man, there were no good choices, only degrees of survival purchased at costs that no accounting could justify. Lyssa kept a bottle of Amasec from my belongings, never opened it, placed it on a shelf in her small quarters where it gathered dust, a memorial not to poison but to the brother who had died tasting poison so she could live. And sometimes she looked at it and wondered whether I had been brave or foolish, whether my sacrifice was noble or simply another example of how the Imperium consumed its children, whether she should honor my memory or resent what my service had represented. And she never arrived at an answer because there was no answer, because the question itself was designed to be unanswerable, because that was how systems of exploitation maintained themselves, by making the exploited complicit in their own exploitation, by forcing impossible choices that made everyone guilty, by creating conditions where survival itself became a form of betrayal. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is no such thing as a free meal. Someone always pays the price, usually with their life, and the system that demands such payment calls itself necessary, calls itself order, calls itself civilization, and most people accept this because the alternative is acknowledging that they live in hell, that they participate in horror, that their comfort is purchased with others' suffering. And that acknowledgement would require action, would require change, would require courage that most people do not have, because courage itself has been systematically destroyed by millennia of conditioning that teaches obedience and punishes thought, that rewards compliance and destroys resistance, that makes surviving seem like winning when surviving is just another word for dying slowly. I paid with 13 months of my life so Lissa could have a few years of better food and safer work, and in the Imperium of man, where billions die every day for causes they do not understand. In wars they did not start serving masters who do not know their names. That counts as a happy ending. That counts as success. That counts as the best most people can hope for. And if that truth makes you angry, then congratulations. You understand the Imperium, you see the machine for what it is, and now you have to decide whether you will fight it or feed it, whether you will resist or comply, whether you will die trying to change it or live accepting it. And that is the real poison, the one that kills slower than any toxin, the one that destroys societies rather than individuals. The poison of accepting that this is how things must be, that there is no alternative, that the best you can hope for is to survive a little longer than others, to suffer a little less than those around you, to find small meanings in vast injustice, and to die knowing that nothing you did mattered to the system, but perhaps it mattered to someone. Perhaps one person lived because you died. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that has to be enough. Because if it is not enough, then your death was meaningless. And if your death was meaningless, then what was the point of living? And that question is the final poison, the one no antidote can neutralize, the one that kills hope itself, and hope is all that people like me ever had. All that kept us going, all that made the suffering bearable, and when hope dies, the person dies with it, even if their body continues moving through its routines, even if they keep breathing and eating and working, because living without hope is not living. It is just waiting for death. And I waited for 13 months, and when death finally came, it felt less like an ending than a relief, less like tragedy than completion, less like loss than the only victory people like me ever achieve. The victory of finishing, of being done, of no longer having to taste anything at all.